Hey everyone. You're listening to the TEN7 Podcast, where we get together every fortnight, and sometimes more often, to talk about technology, business, and the humans in it. I'm your host, Ivan Stegic. My guest today is Jeff Geerling, author and software developer, who is deeply involved in numerous open source development communities. He describes himself as a creative person who builds great software. I first saw his name in the Drupal community, but he's really active in Ansible and is also the creator of Drupal VM for local Drupal development, as well as the Raspberry Pi Dramble. Hey, Jeff, welcome. It's a great pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you very much. I've been looking forward to talking to you guys on TEN7's podcast.
I've been looking forward to talking to you as well. I absolutely love Raspberry Pis. I have, I think, at least 10 of them over here. So I don't know if that's catching up to how many you have, but it's it's definitely something that I have tinkered with for the last number of years. And so getting an opportunity to talk to you is very exciting for me.
Yeah, 10 is a good start. You're going to have to up your game a little bit, though.
How many do you have, Jeff? Come on, let's be honest.
Just looking over in my parts bin, I have seven that are not in any active use. I have 4 in my cluster. I have 5 hot spares for other purposes, and 3 that are running household projects right now.
Okay, so close to 20, if not more. That's a lot of Raspberry Pis.
It fluctuates depending on what projects I'm working on.
Man, that's awesome. Well, I kind of want to spend the whole interview talking about Raspberry Pis and the Raspberry Pi Dramble that you have and that you've been working on recently, and that's been going for about 4 years now, I think. But before we kind of dive deep into that, I'd like to kind of get an understanding just a little bit about Jeff Geerling, the man. Where do you live in the world? Where did you go to school? What do you do in life? You're not just playing with Raspberry Pis all the time.
No, I live in St. Louis, Missouri, which is pretty near the geographical center of the United States. Some people call it flyover country, but because of that, we actually now have a Drupal camp named Flyover Camp that
yes,
I attended last year.
That's awesome.
And that I got to meet one of TEN7's employees, Tess Flynn, there. She had a really good talk on Kubernetes, but I love living in the Midwest. One of the best advantages is I have like a lot of family here. The cost of living is lower than coastal cities, and I get to still do a lot of remote work. And the coolest thing is any flight anywhere in the U.S. is only about 2.5 hours, whereas a lot of times I get somewhere and they're like, oh, I just got off a 6 or 7 hour flight from the other coast. So it's nice to be able to get around anywhere in the U.S. and still have family and all those benefits. And I actually studied philosophy, which has, well, you could say it has nothing to do with programming or nothing to do with tech, but really a lot of the philosophy I studied was logic and reason and things like that, which if you're a programmer, that's pretty much all you deal with on a day-to-day basis. Actually, if you're dealing with Kubernetes, logic is out the window. But
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. It's a different kind of logic, right?
Yeah, deep down there's ones and zeros somewhere underneath, and you have to understand that. So I studied philosophy. I actually went to a seminary to be a priest for a few years.
Oh.
And ended up finding that was not what I was meant to do. So I was meant to be, I wanted to get married. So I ended up leaving the seminary, getting married, have 3 kids and a wife, and happy to be here in St. Louis. One of the things other than that in my life that's really affected a lot, especially how I work and the jobs I've worked and things, is my Crohn's disease. It's a chronic illness that I have that has required a few surgeries. It's required a lot of time in the hospital. In fact, I was just in the hospital a couple weeks ago for it. But because of that, I've always been extremely grateful to have the skills that I have in tech, because I can work. There's been many times where I'd been in the hospital, but nobody would even know it because I'm still doing my work, since I can do everything I need to on a computer or an iPad or whatever. and work remote. So I'm extremely happy and feel very blessed to be able to do that kind of work. And in open source, everything is asynchronous. So that benefits me, because if I had to do a job where I had to be in a desk or be at a place doing manual labor certain hours in a day, and I had to miss a lot of work, that would not be I wouldn't be a very good employee, but I can be a good employee doing remote work and open source work, even though I have Crohn's disease, which impacts my life and a lot of my friends' lives pretty deeply.
I don't know very much about Crohn's disease. I know it's related to your digestive system, and I think to your intestines.
Yep.
Is it something that you're genetically predisposed to have? Is it something that's hereditary? Is it something that how did you find out?
It's something that's still under investigation. One of the difficult things, Crohn's is in a family of immune-related diseases. And for pretty much all of them, it's hard to say right now with the research we have if it's more genetic or more environmental, all those different things. There's a lot of theories. And one other interesting thing, and a good reason why I stay in St. Louis, we have one of probably the top 5 or 10 Crohn's research facilities in St. Louis at our local WashU hospital and medical school. And I've been able to talk to some of the best Crohn's doctors in the world, and all of them have theories, and all of them, there's a lot of research, but not a lot of concrete facts other than, throw these medicines at it and hope for the best. And unfortunately, in my life, I've tried literally every medicine. I'm not joking. Every medicine that's ever been made for Crohn's, I've been on it. One of them paralyzed me from the waist down, so I got off that medicine.
Oh, my God.
Was not paralyzed anymore, so that was good. Another one caused anaphylaxis, so I'm like, okay, I'm not going to take that one. So all these drugs, some of them are life-changing, but a lot of them don't last very long because the way that they operate, your body starts reacting to them no matter what. So once you hit that, you start doing surgeries, and that's the stage I'm in right now, but the good thing is, if you, in my mind, if you have a positive outlook on it, if you can find ways to work with it, you can bounce back. I'm generally a very optimistic person, and I think that's also how I can survive in the open source world where things can get a bit dicey sometimes.
Yes, they certainly can. Well, I'm glad that you're able to talk about Crohn's so openly, and I hope that your last bout wasn't a terrible one, a bad one, and I hope you're on the upswing.
No, I was only in the ICU for one day. That's a good thing.
Oh my gosh! Wow. Well, I'm glad to be talking to you about it. So you're in the Midwest. Working remotely is amazing. And you might know we became remote in 2017, and we're not looking back. It's definitely, opened up so many different avenues for us. And so I'm glad that you have that as well, to be able to do what you do at home. The PiDramble.com site, I want to start at the end and then kind of work back to how you are hosting PiDramble.com in your basement on a cluster of Raspberry Pis. And they run Ansible and Kubernetes and Drupal and Nginx and all kinds of things. And to someone who heard a whole bunch of jargon right now and doesn't understand why this is a really cool thing, can you describe what PiDramble.com is?
Yeah, so most of us who have a Drupal site or WordPress or whatever kind of website we're running, most of us have a cloud hosting provider, and you never have to worry about things like servers and power and networking and all that kind of stuff. You just go online, buy service, and then you upload a Drupal site to it and log in and edit your stuff. I've always wanted to have as much control as I can over my hosting and my sites and my performance and all that. And so a few years back when the Raspberry Pi came out, it was interesting. The first couple versions of the Raspberry Pi were super underpowered. And if you installed Drupal, I think Drupal 6 or 7 was the current version at the time. Even that version, you'd install Drupal on it. It would take a minute or two for a page to load. They were super slow. Wow. They didn't have much memory or anything. But as time went on, the Raspberry Pi Foundation kept introducing newer, faster models. And somewhere around like 2015 or 2014, I think I don't remember exactly when, they introduced the Raspberry Pi 2. And that model had enough memory to actually run Drupal pretty well. So I bought a few of those to see if I could set up a Drupal cluster and run my own Drupal website in my own house using a cluster of them. You could do it on one Raspberry Pi, but the Raspberry Pis are not, because of the fact that they use micro SD cards, which are not like as fast or as good as hard drives for longevity, much less SSDs that most of us have nowadays. Because of that, if you just run it on one Raspberry Pi, it's kind of flaky and it might just blow up and die one day, and then you have to reinstall it and stuff. So I wanted to see if I could make a robust little cluster of computers to run a Drupal site. And there was a secondary thing that I was trying to do too, is to make a little cluster of computers to demonstrate like running Drupal or other applications like it in a high availability way with multiple servers, and have it be able to be like in a little box that I could bring with me somewhere. So I started doing that. I brought it to Drupal Camp St. Louis. I brought it to DrupalCon. I think the first one was Austin that I brought it to. And Dries actually took a picture of it. This was before I worked for Acquia. And actually I was hired by Acquia soon after DrupalCon. Completely unrelated, but it was just an interesting aside. Dries came up and he's like, "Oh, what is that?" And I'm like, "Oh, it's my Raspberry Pi cluster." He's like, "Oh, that's really cool. I got to take a picture." So he and I now have shared more stories about pictures and things. He's actually a pretty decent photographer. Right? Yeah, and I've always loved photography. Used to do it semi-professionally, did some photojournalism, but don't get to do as much nowadays. However, some of my other Raspberry Pi projects do have to do with cameras. But getting back to the Pi Dramble, over the years I've made it more robust. I've done some more work to automate the setup process. I documented everything in excruciating detail. There's videos on the website of how to do the first version of the cluster. I haven't set up new videos for the current version, but in 2017, when Kubernetes was getting to be a lot more popular and I was starting to use it for some things, I thought, maybe it could run on the Pi. And it ran, but it just barely ran. So I had a lot of trouble because the Raspberry Pi only had 1 gigabyte of memory, and that was the absolute minimum you could run Kubernetes on. Yeah. So I got it working. It was kind of janky and kind of fell apart sometimes, and I was getting really frustrated. But in 2018, the Raspberry Pi, was it 2018 or 2019? Was that this year that the Pi 4 came out?
Pi 4 came out this year. I believe it was in June. I think they were talking about it for months, but no one ever knew when it would come out. It was, so I think, June of this year. More
recent than I remembered, but the day it came out, I ordered. It's really hard to get Raspberry Pis right after their release because they're very popular for makers and hackers and things, and people who have fun with computers. And so I placed an order from a company in the UK for one, because most of them have limits on the orders for the first few weeks. So I did one from the UK, one from a place in the US. I got 2 from Micro Center. They're usually the best place to get them in the US.
Yes, they are.
And so I got those 4 together, and I got the 2 gigabyte models. And with 2 gigabytes of RAM, Kubernetes actually ran pretty well. So that's the current state of my cluster. I have Kubernetes running. I have Drupal running on Kubernetes. I have the 2 gigabyte Raspberry Pi 4s, and I power them using power over Ethernet, which means that I only have 1 cable I have to plug into each Pi. So if you go to PiDramble.com, the picture there shows you how they look and what they do.
Now, what the heck is a Dramble? I mean, I know what a bramble bush is, but let's take it back. Let's take it down. What's a Dramble?
Yeah, so a Dramble is I guess it's called a portmanteau when you put together different words. A bramble is a bush of raspberries. So, when you see a raspberry bush, I usually call it a raspberry bush, but a lot of people call it a bramble.
I knew that was the case. Bramble was something I knew.
Yeah. So traditionally, from the beginning of the Raspberry Pi, people who made clusters of them called them Brambles. That's not as much the case anymore since Raspberry Pis got super popular. But early on, everybody would say, I have a bramble of Pis. But my bramble of Pis was running Drupal. And so I took Drupal and Bramble and put them together, and it came up with Dramble. little did I know at the time, that was also when I registered the domain for it, that the word Dramble, if you looked it up and found it on certain like urban dictionary type sites, it had a very different definition. But I think now if you search on Google, my Pi Dramble site might have a higher ranking for it. So
I just did that. I typed in Dramble because, I want to know what it means on Urban Dictionary, and the first hit was pidramble.com. So
great. Yeah, see,
so you're
Drupal
good.
SEO. Drupal SEO is so good after all these years.
If anybody listening out there needs Drupal SEO, Jeff is the guy.
Yeah. So another funny thing that I found out when I was, so that was the original reasoning, but somebody asked me more about it one time, and I was like, I'll look up a little more information. And I found out that other, like the generic term, so raspberries are brambles, that's their type of bush. But all the different types of berries that are like it, like raspberries, blackberries, dewberries, all those things, they actually grow in clusters, they call them aggregates of Druplelets. And I was like, this is like Providence, Druplelets. So it's a Dramble of Druplelets. It's spelled Drupelets, but that is the official biological term, I guess.
I thought you're making that up. You're not. That can't be possible. Drupelet? That's basically Drupal, except. Oh, okay. So
if you go to Wikipedia and search for Drupe, Drupe, it has a whole article about Druplets.
Oh my gosh! Look at that. A stone fruit.
Yeah, I don't think I would want to eat a stone fruit. That doesn't sound very tasty.
That does not sound tasty. How interesting. So what a great name for this little cluster of Drupal technology, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you talked about creating the cluster. Can we go back to the first version of the Raspberry Pi cluster, the Dramble that you created? What were the versions? Or it was a Raspberry Pi 2, I think, or 2 Plus, or something like that. And I'd like to hear about the stack, because I think the stack of technology has changed over the years.
Yeah. The first version was a very traditional cluster of web server technology. It was based on LAMP, and actually the first ever version, which I never actually put up on GitHub. The first version that I had locally was running Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. And the way I had it set up was the top server was running Apache, and Apache was set up to redirect web requests to the two PHP servers that were server number 2 and 3. And then I had 2 database servers. There was the database, the primary or master server, and then the secondary server that was set up to replicate the master in case the master goes down. And so that was, there's still a lot of people that run those kind of setups where there's a server for each one of those purposes, and you might be in Amazon or somewhere else. Or if you're using a cloud hosting provider for Drupal, some of them still set up their servers that way, where you have dedicated servers for database and all that. And the cool thing about it was I used Ansible to do everything. And I actually used almost the same kind of Ansible playbook that I use for Drupal VM to manage all those individual servers and get them set up. So I could I timed it one time in about 35 minutes it took from the time that you had the hardware plugged in to the time it was serving up a Drupal website with a fully redundant, highly available, relatively high performance, because we're talking about Raspberry Pis,
right,
cluster of computers. So that was the first version way back. And then soon after that, I switched to using Nginx, just because it was a little easier to configure Nginx to be that load balancer layer. And also Nginx has built-in caching. So instead of having like a Varnish server, I could use Nginx for that purpose, because it had the basic caching I needed. Varnish is way better for some things, but I switched to Nginx mostly because you just like change a couple settings and it caches images
and you're done.
Things. Really, really easy.
How many total versions have there been now? If we fast forward to the Raspberry Pi 4 cluster that you have now, how many versions have there been, and what are the kind of the biggest lessons you've learned in the evolution of this cluster?
There's been 4 major versions. It hasn't been like each Pi model is a new version. It's more like each technological shift has been a new version. The first version had that first 2 database servers set up and all that. The second version, I actually ditched the replica MySQL server because for 2 reasons. One is it's not that easy to maintain a replica setup like that with MySQL. Especially for people who are who are newer to the whole LAMP stack and management and things. And even with automation, it can be a little difficult. So I ditched that just because that was never a problem in the real world for me. And the most important thing was just to have a backup of the primary server. So I have a nightly backup that it does. And then the second thing was just streamlining things, making it a little simpler. The first versions I had a lot of configurability and things, but really you want the server to be easy to set up and easy to manage. And the more complexity you add to a project like this, especially if it's a hobby project and I'm not earning tons of income from it. In fact, I've never earned a dime from it, but I have gotten to go to a couple Drupal camps and things, and it's been great to learn from it. But making it simpler is better. So I think version 2 is just kind of simplifying the architecture, making it so that you could use 4 or 5 Raspberry Pis instead of requiring 6, things like that. And then version 3, I think version 3 might have been the first Kubernetes version. I could be wrong there, because that was about a year ago that I came out with 3. And I started working on getting everything into Kubernetes, which makes it easier to scale up or scale down if you want to. You could have 100 Raspberry Pis or 2 Raspberry Pis or 4, depending on how redundant you want everything, how scalable. Because Kubernetes lets you say, instead of this server is MySQL and this server is PHP, you can say, I want to have 3 PHP things and 2 MySQL things and 1 load balancer thing. And it just puts them on servers. And you can tell it for MySQL, I don't want the 2 MySQLs to be on the same server because that would be bad for performance. So Kubernetes sorts all that out for you. And you just say, hey, Kubernetes, I have these 5 things I want to run. And I have these 4 servers. Go do your thing. And Kubernetes manages it for you. That's the cool thing about Kubernetes. It's more complicated than that in the real world, but it's getting easier as time goes on. Kubernetes is one technology that started out crazy complicated and has gotten a lot easier over the years as they refine it, as they make things more robust and a little easier to get started with, and as people understand it more.
And is everything in the cluster now orchestrated with Ansible, and is everything virtualized as containers inside Kubernetes, or do you still have an ingress that's an Nginx or on a separate Raspberry Pi, for example?
Almost everything. So right now the ingress is actually running inside of Kubernetes, and the way that I have it set up is you just point your DNS at one of the Raspberry Pis. So that's obviously not wonderful. If that one Raspberry Pi goes down, you got to point your DNS at another Raspberry Pi. So that's one slight weakness of the architecture. But as an alternative, you could have another Raspberry Pi being the ingress and be a load balancer. But then if that Raspberry Pi goes down, you have a problem. So that's one case where having a cloud internet provider, a cloud hosting provider like Amazon or Google is really nice because you can have their cloud balancers, cloud load balancers. They take care of all the really complicated stuff in terms of when you get a request for your website, what happens if one of the servers that is routing those requests goes down. All those cloud systems, they kind of self-heal automatically with DNS and with all their different things. When you're running a website in your basement, you have one IP address, and it's not very reliable usually, especially if you're using most ISPs in the USA. And and you don't get any more IP addresses. And if that route goes bad and one server goes down, you can have a lot of issues. So that's one area. One of the main reasons why I would say if you have a website that sells things or you generate a lot of revenue off your website, you probably don't want to run it inside your house like the Pi Dramble website is, because it does have, 10, 20 minutes every few days of downtime when my ISP is just like, yeah, you guys aren't getting internet for right now. Too bad. That happens a lot.
What do you think the biggest lesson is that you've learned going from your first version to this, the latest one that you have?
I think the biggest thing is just how managing a cluster with Kubernetes. Managing Kubernetes is difficult. It's still not easy, but managing a cluster of application stuff with Kubernetes is a lot easier than it was when it was just individual servers, because you used to have to manage each application on each server, and it would take a lot of time to get things set up and to tweak things and to make sure all the backups were good. When you standardize in Kubernetes and have everything running in a container, it is more complicated at the start when you're learning it, because containers means that you have to build the container and you have to, have a place to store the container and all that. But once you have that set up, everything is automated, like out of the box. You don't have to spend time worrying about how do I get this to go here and how do I change the configuration. You just say like deploy this version and it's there and it's happy, and Kubernetes does it all for you. So that was the biggest lesson, was like sometimes the complexity does save a lot of hassle if you need it. There's obviously a lot of people listening to this probably, you might not need to be doing your own hosting stuff. I don't technically need to, but I do like to, because a lot of the work that I do does have to be more complex. So doing these fun side projects for me teaches me things. Another cool lesson I had was there's a lot of things in when you're running on a server that's slower, there's a lot of things you learn to worry about that will save your skin when you run something on even faster servers when they're under heavy load. Now, one of the biggest instances of that is when you have a really slow hard drive access, like when it takes a long time to write files on the Raspberry Pi, which it does a lot, you start bumping into weird issues that you never see if you only ran your tests on your local computer that has a Intel Core 2 Duo or whatever the latest i9 chip or something. If you're doing that with an SSD all the time, you're not going to run into these weird issues. Mm-hmm. But when you're on a cloud hosting provider, which most companies do use those, most sites are on cloud hosting now, disk access can sometimes go crazy. And the error messages you see and the behaviors you see can get confusing because you never really notice that, and you can't replicate it locally. But I've been able to replicate some of those weird things on a Raspberry Pi just because it's so slow, the disk access. I actually found a bug in Twig with the way that Twig renders files if you have multiple computers writing to an NFS device, a storage device, and that device is writing slowly. I found that this was in Drupal 8.0, like the first version, right around the beta timeframe was when I found the issue. The issue is still there in 8.0, but they fixed it. It was a race condition when you have multiple servers writing to slow shared storage. And this was good because other people, like it's not just Raspberry Pis. If you're using cloud storage, a lot of cloud storage providers have throttling, and you can run into the throttling sometimes. So instead of the site going down, it might just be slow. So it's not all for naught and for fun. Sometimes there was that issue that I found that was an actual bug in Drupal that we fixed.
Yeah, it's amazing the kinds of things you learn when you try to scale down hardware or scale up requests and scale up bandwidth. You just don't see things in the general unless you do something. So that's always interesting to me as well. One of the things that I just realized as you were talking was that you actually had to come up with a way to install Kubernetes on Raspbian. And that means that you had to basically either compile Kubernetes for ARM, or there are already precompiled packages. And I never actually thought that... that never actually dawned on me. So how hard was it to put Kubernetes on ARM infrastructure?
So it was perfect timing for me to be getting into Kubernetes on Pi around 2017. I think it was a teenager. I don't remember the guy's name, But there was somebody who just loved Raspberry Pis and loved Kubernetes, and he spent all this time making sure that the Kubernetes build system built and tested ARM architecture stuff for all the Kubernetes releases. And it just got into like Kubernetes 1.8 or 1.9 or something like that right before I got started. And so when I was looking into it, it's like, oh, you just install Kubernetes, just like everything else. However, Kubernetes is one part of the equation when you're talking about running Kubernetes, a cluster that runs Kubernetes, because you also need something to run the containers, and that's usually Docker. And Docker for ARM is a little bit different. You have to install it differently, and there's some things you manage differently. The versions are sometimes older, and there's weird specific version things that cause trouble. So I ran into some issues there. And so I actually created a separate Ansible role for Docker ARM from my normal Docker one, because the ARM one is more complicated and convoluted. But it's running pretty well now. And then another thing that you find out if you're using Raspberry Pis, since the chip is an ARM processor, it's not this typical processor in most of our laptops and servers, which is AMD 64 or x86. Since it's a different architecture, everything has to be compiled for that architecture, and container images often have to have a specific version of the image built for it. So a lot of times you'll be like, oh, I want to deploy this to the Raspberry Pi. And you deploy it, and the Raspberry Pi, and Kubernetes is like, yeah, I'm not going to deploy that. And you're like, why aren't you going to do that? It says, yeah, it's not for ARM. And then it's like, oh, and then you have to figure out, like, is it important enough for me to rebuild this image for ARM, or, that kind of thing. So I actually build and maintain a set of PHP and Apache base images for the Raspberry Pi, and they're on my Docker Hub account under Geerling Guy. Those are the ones that I use on the Raspberry Pi and build on top of. And a lot of images now are supporting ARM, because you can get ARM servers from Amazon and from other companies.
But it's also a little deep, like it's a little more complex than just ARM, though, if I'm not mistaken. There are different versions of ARM.
Yeah.
And different, not just different versions, but different, like some are 32-bit and some are 64-bit. And you can say ARM, but it's actually it's even harder, because you have to know what architecture you're building for to make sure that when you build it, it actually runs on that ARM processor. So my guess is you actually had to update your images when you went from 2 to 3 to 4.
Yeah, so there's obviously the Raspberry Pi has its own OS that's kind of like the official one, called Raspbian, and it's based on Debian, but it's a 32-bit OS. And there's some initiatives to upgrade to 64-bit, especially now that the Raspberry Pi 4 has more RAM and can use more of that 64-bit power. But a lot of the things are either ARM v6, ARM v7, or ARM 64, and you have to always figure out which one is which. And I think all the ones that I'm building right now are ARM v7, because that's what works on Raspbian. But if you run a different OS on the Pis, which you can, there's Ubuntu and Debian, like actual Debian and Fedora and some other versions that you can run on the Raspberry Pis, you might have to get a different version of a container, which may not exist again. So it's not for the faint of heart to get things running on the Pi all the time. It's a lot easier. Every year it gets easier, because more and more people support Raspberry Pi stuff. There's a lot of companies. It's an interesting thing, since I do write a lot about Pis. I found out about a lot of companies who you wouldn't even think about it, who do remote control systems, they do signage, they do radio frequency stuff, they do logging systems, all kinds of things that are industrial and commercial applications that use Raspberry Pis for everything. And so there's a lot more support for it nowadays than there was 5 or 10 years ago, when it was only a bunch of people, playing around with stuff in their houses. Nowadays, the Raspberry Pi is a more serious computing platform.
What a great success story, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's cool. So you've seen Tessa's, you mentioned that you'd seen Tessa's talk at Flyover Camp, and so you're probably familiar with Flight Deck and the hosting that we've been talking about, hosting live sites using Drupal on Kubernetes. She's done some great work in developing that for us, and as you know, we've open sourced all of it. But one of the things it requires is S3 block storage, like the ones from spaces from DigitalOcean, for example. I wanted to talk to you about two ideas. One, how hard would it be to get flight deck powered Kubernetes hosting onto your cluster? And two, since it requires S3 block storage, have you thought about implementing block storage on your Dramble?
That's an interesting question, because probably of all the issues there are in hosting Drupal on Kubernetes or any kind of what we call nowadays cloud native hosting environments, one of the main issues is always, how do you store files for Drupal? And it's complicated because it's not just like in WordPress or a lot of other systems. Usually when you ask that question, you're just talking about media uploads. Like, I'm creating a blog post and I upload a picture to put in the blog post. Where do I put the picture? That's part of Drupal's problem. And that one is very perfectly solved by block storage and works great with that. You can integrate with CDNs and things. There's a lot of different solutions for that. And you can even, like what I do on the Raspberry Pi right now is I use NFS, which is not block storage, but it's just a networked file system that is shared among all the servers. And Kubernetes mounts it into Drupal so Drupal can write to it. But when you're talking about Drupal, you're also talking about things like the Twig cache files. Every time that you load up a Drupal 8 website, it has to write a bunch of Twig cache files that are like compiled PHP, and it currently writes them by default into your public file system. So that's a lot of files that are read at least once per server. And so having a slow storage solution can cause problems with that. And having slow writes can cause problems with that. And then you also are talking about CSS compilation and JavaScript compilation. So there's more complicated things with Drupal. And so I've seen some people doing S3 block storage. And as you say, as long as you have a provider that is compatible with the Amazon S3 kind of API for writing files, it works. So you can do it on DigitalOcean. There are open source block storage software that you can do. And I think if I were to put it on a Raspberry Pi, I'd probably use one of those open source packages and install it on the Pi. Or if it's an internet site, available to the internet, you could even use DigitalOcean spaces or Amazon S3, even though you're hosting it locally. So those are options for it. But I've also seen people use, I think you guys might even use Fly System or something like that to make Drupal integrate with it. There's some PHP level stuff that you can do to write files in different places. But that is probably the number one thing that people ask about and people debate about. And I've gone 100 which ways. I think I built it 5 or 10 different ways in the real world clusters that I built that aren't on Raspberry Pis. So that is the $1 million question, I think, right now. And there's even a couple issues on Drupal.org exploring, like, how can we make it easier to use a file system in Drupal that's shared but doesn't have to make it so complicated.
You're actually right about Fly System. That's exactly how Tess implemented the file storage in the solution we have for hosting Drupal on Kubernetes with Flight Deck. It's possible to do. If you set up the infrastructure so that you have enough caching, those first-time hits don't seem as bad. And we run our own live site and other clients' sites in production with Flight Deck and with block storage. And so we use Fly System in Drupal 8, and then we've also got Drupal 7 sites that we're running on the Kubernetes infrastructure. But I don't recall the name of the module that we're using. It's not Fly System because it came along only in Drupal 8.
Yeah, I know I've used in the past S3FS as well, but it had some...
yeah, that's it. I think that's what it is.
Yeah, it's one of those things where for most sites, it will work perfectly fine, but there's always going to be some site that's doing some weird thing, and you're like, there's no native storage. There's no good answer. Yeah, I know. It's when you're dealing with when you have control over the sites, that's the best. Like, I have control over the Pi Dramble site, so if you look at it, you'll see I intentionally kept that thing super simple because even under load, the Raspberry Pis can handle that. If I had, commenting and accounts and all kinds of crazy things going on and real-time chat and who knows what else that I've seen on people's sites, it's going to fall over. So.
Well, how taxed do those Raspberry Pi 4s end up being? I've seen that you're writing about the ice tower, the need for active cooling on the processors now. How is the cluster handling traffic? And tell me a little bit about ice tower. It sounds so cool.
It's funny you ask about that. Right now, I'm looking at my Mac in front of me, just doing this podcast. The CPU's at like 80%, and it's like dying, and the fans are on. And it's funny because the Pi is sitting over there. The fan's not even on because it's not hot enough. So, the Raspberry Pi, generally speaking, if you're not, mining Bitcoin or something on it, it's not going to use a whole lot of CPU, and it's not going to need a whole lot of cooling power. However, when I do these projects, I always try to go the extra mile and then an extra 10 miles after that. And I always tax them until until I can break them, basically. And so I do a lot of performance benchmarking on them. And I found that the Raspberry Pi 3B Plus and the Raspberry Pi 4 both, they are not quite as good at keeping their cool. The Raspberry Pi 4 was even worse than the Raspberry Pi 3. And it was found pretty early on that the reason for that was they had a little flaw in the way that they implemented USB. They added a new USB controller that makes it USB 3, which is awesome. It's way faster than the old Raspberry Pis with USB 2. You can get external hard drives and things are a lot faster. Connection has gigabit Ethernet. That's awesome because the old Pis were always constrained to like 200 megabits or 100 megabits, way slower. So it's really awesome, but the first version of the Pi 4 ROM or bootloader, it had a flaw in it that would keep the USB chip in high power mode like all the time. So the Raspberry Pi 4, even if you just turned it on and left it sitting there, it would just get hotter and hotter. If you left it out in the open, which is a bad idea for dust and things like that, if you drop something on it and it's, you short out a circuit or something. So everybody should have a Pi in a case if you're going to have it running for any period of time. If you have it in a case, it just sits there and turns into a little oven, and it cooks itself, and then it starts throttling the CPU because it gets so hot. So I recommended, I did an early article about this months ago, right after it was released, on how it gets super hot, and it's really bad because if you put it in a case, it'll just cook itself. And that's without much load. If you put load on it, it just starts throttling right away. So I said you basically have to have a fan on the thing. And I still recommend having a fan on the new Pi. But they released a firmware update it was only a few weeks ago that they released this firmware update that sets the USB chip into the correct mode for, it very slightly reduced the performance of USB, but not really in any huge meaningful way for most people's usage. But it makes the Pi like 8 degrees Celsius cooler, which is hugely significant. That's a huge difference. And I've been doing measurements. I posted one blog post a week or so ago on this, and I'm going to be doing another one because I tested with a couple more cases how that affects the Pi's cooling. But basically, the general thing that I'd say now is you still need to have some method of cooling the Pis. So for my cluster, I have the Raspberry Pi hat, the Power over Ethernet hat that has a fan built into it. And all that fan does is blows a little bit of air onto the processor. That's enough to keep it cool because you just need some convection over that processor. If you put it in a case, there's no convection because the case is just going to hold that air inside of it and heat it up. If you have it open air or if you have a fan blowing on it, it will make some convection. It'll take the air and move it over the processor, take that heat away. So that's all that's really needed. But a company called Seed Studios, I think, or S2 Pi, they sent me this thing. It's this Colossus heatsink. It's not Colossus when you compare it to I don't know if anybody ever built a Pentium 2 rig back in the day. But you'd have those giant coolers that were like the size of a computer nowadays. And a giant fan or two fans on either side of it blowing air through it. Or if you ever saw the Power Mac G5 quad core, I saw one of those one time, and the cooling system is bigger than everything else on the computer. It's kind of the equivalent of that for a Raspberry Pi, because a Raspberry Pi is the size of a credit card. And this ice tower is like the size of the whole board, but super tall as well. And if you use it, you can't put it in a case, but it does do an unbelievably good job at cooling the Raspberry Pi. It cools the Raspberry Pi so cool that it's almost like you don't even have it running when you have the fan on the thing. It does what it says it does. It keeps it ice cold, but at a bit of an expense. You can't use Pi hats with it if you use that cooler. You can't fit it in most conventional cases. But if you do,
you can. If you can't put it in a cluster.
Yeah, if you were doing web hosting, it wouldn't be a bad idea to build a custom little case for these things, because that would keep the CPU so cold that it would operate a little better. It would make the Pi operate a little better.
Does it have contact with the CPU?
Yeah, it comes with a little thermal pad. It's like a little piece of rubber, but it's thermal rubber, and you just wedge it between the CPU and the cooler. It has one copper heat pipe that goes up and down, and that copper attaches to cooling fins. The cooling fins distribute the heat, and even if you run it without the fan, it's going to keep it way cooler than just blowing a fan over the processor. It does a really good job at cooling, and the fan makes it do even better job. Like the difference was, without the ice tower, it was like 60 degrees Celsius. With the ice tower, it was 30 degrees Celsius. It was a huge difference.
That's a giant difference. Wow. Well, it's unfortunate you can't use it in your whole cluster, because that little compact package you have, I would assume the ice tower just doesn't allow for it.
Yeah. Luckily with the tower, since I switched to the Pi hat, the Power Ethernet hat for it, since it has those built-in fans, that's just enough to keep it from overheating. With Kubernetes running, Kubernetes does take up some CPU constantly, so it does get hotter over time, but it stays under the throttling threshold. Another option that I actually bought one because I kept having people tell me, like, you should try the Flirk case, and I'm like, what? Okay, whatever, I'll buy one. So I bought one this week, and I tested it, and it doesn't do as good a job as the ice tower, but it's FLIRC, the Flirk case. It's basically a giant aluminum heatsink case for the Pi. The case actually attaches to the CPU, and it does do a pretty good job cooling it. It keeps it down at like 40 to 45 Celsius, which is still way better than just having an open air or having a little fan blowing on it. But having a cluster of these, they'd probably still get super hot. So having a cluster, you got to have some sort of fan blowing the heat out. Otherwise, it's just going to turn into a little oven.
Now, in addition to all the hobbies you have, side projects and so on, you are also an author. And I would love to hear about your latest book and the book that you've written on Kubernetes. What are you working on right now? Yeah,
so I love writing. I don't know how many million words I've written in my life on my blog and on other blogs and things. But I love writing. And in 2013 or so, I think that was when I started. I've always wanted to write a book. My whole life, I'm like, I want to write a book sometime. I think part of that was jealousy because my brother, when he was a kid, wrote a book, and his book, like, the 15 Minutes of Fame, like his book caught fire and was a local, very popular book. He sold maybe 15,000 copies or something. It was pretty cool, being the little brother to the brother who wrote that cool book. But I was also a little jealous, like, I want to do that too. So, but I also just love writing. I've always loved English and literature growing up, and I love reading and I love writing. So that I put that together with the fact that Ansible didn't have a book in 2014 when I started with in 2013, but in 2014 I'm like, there's still no book for Ansible, and it's really popular. So I decided to start writing it with the goal that I would write 100 pages and sell 200 copies. And it was funny because I started writing it on a platform called LeanPub, where you can publish it while you're writing it and sell it while you're writing it. And by the time I had written about 40 pages, I already had sold 200 copies. And then, fast forward these many years later, it's 2019. So it's been in print for 5 years now. And I now sell it on Amazon and other places. And it's called Ansible for DevOps. And that book has sold over 22,000 copies. And it's now like 480 something pages, including a chapter on Kubernetes and a chapter on Docker, and a couple examples that do Drupal. One of them inspired by the Raspberry Pi Dramble cluster. So that was my first book effort, and it went incredibly well, and I was floored. There's no word to describe, like, when you're like, I want to do this thing my whole life, and this is my goal, and then your goal is like surpassed by like 50 times over, and you get to meet awesome people because of it, and it's just so many cool things happen because of that book. It also helped us in my family. We've wanted to remodel our kitchen, and after writing the book and making some profit off of it, I was able to remodel the kitchen like 4 years earlier than we thought we might be able to. So, that's a huge change for our life, because our old kitchen was kind of hard with 3 kids and the way that we live our life and stuff at home, especially since I work remote and I'm at home all the time. It was, we had an old cramped little kitchen, and we were able to get it better. So like the book was just awesome. I don't expect to have the same level of success, but who knows? You never know where it's going to lead. But I'm working on another book. I actually just finished the first chapter a few nights ago, and I have a structure for the rest of it, and I'm working on examples and chapters. The next book is going to be called Ansible for Kubernetes, and maybe if Ansible's still around in 5 years and there's another game-changing cloud infrastructure thing, it'll be Ansible for that, and I'll have a whole series out. But I'm working on that book, and I haven't published it yet. I probably will pretty soon. Even though it's not finished, I'll publish in progress updates on LeanPub. But both of those books, if you go to Ansible for DevOps, all spelled out, or Ansible for Kubernetes.com, those are the book sites. And I love writing them. And one of the best things about writing them in progress is, for both books, I've had a lot of interaction with the people who read it, and they can help me to, like, if they're interested in something, I can write about that. Or if they are like, your example didn't work on my computer, I can improve it before I actually make a published printed version that people will buy.
I very much appreciate knowing about Ansible for Kubernetes. I didn't know that was what you were working on. And I think we actually bought Ansible for DevOps, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, thank you.
When Tess first started working for us, we wanted to make a big change to how we were doing things at TEN7 and the custom scripts we had, and we wanted more automation. And Tess was very interested in Ansible being the thing, and we had to learn it. So you've certainly provided a great deal of information and help to TEN7 in that manner as well. So we wish you all the best for your new book, Ansible for Kubernetes, and we'll be linking to it from the show notes on the podcast episode as well.
That's great. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Well, I think that's a wrap. We should say goodbye, and thank you so much for being on the show. It's been a great pleasure talking to you, and I hope to talk to you again soon. And I'm going to go to Micro Center right now on a number of different visits, because you can't buy more than one at a time, and buy some more Raspberry Pis so that I have more than you do.
Yeah, you can.
I don't know what I'm going to do with them, though.
Well, you can always get a bunch of Raspberry Pi Zeros and stick them in people's stocking stuffers, that kind of thing.
Oh, that's a good idea. That's a good idea. Stocking stuffer, $5 Raspberry Pi Zero. Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. It's been great. Author and software developer Jeff Geerling was my guest today, and you can find him across the web using the handle @GeerlingGuy. You can also find him online at jeffgeerling.com, and of course, the Raspberry Pi Dramble is at pidramble.com. And if you're interested in either of those books, you should go to ansiblefordevops.com or ansibleforkubernetes.com. You've been listening to the TEN7 Podcast. Find us online at ten7.com/podcast. And if you have a second, do send us a message. We love hearing from you. Our email address is podcast@ten7.com. Until next time, this is Ivan Stegic. Thank you for listening.